Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the beautiful Bryce Canyon. We actually arrived here yesterday and started scouting the entire location in the late afternoon and into the sunset hours so I could be in the correct position to capture the sunrise in this area overlooking a rock formation called Thors Hammer. It's always a good idea to arrive on a location at least a day or two early so you can assess all of the available positions for a good shot. Doing my research, I saw that there was a particular rock formation called Thors Hammer. So what I wanted to do was walk down a little bit so I could frame Thors Hammer, some of these rock formations, which are actually called hoodoos, and be able to capture the sunrise in frame. You can actually see Thors Hammer from the top, from the sunrise and sunset viewpoints. But if you get close to the sunset viewpoint, you'll start to see a meandering trail that moves all the way through. Now, this trail actually takes you through some of these beautiful hoodoos and out the other side. It's a nice trail to walk. It definitely gives you a great orientation of the park itself. But as you come down about 3 turns, there's this one bend, the one that I'm actually standing on, all the way through the back, which gives you different views of Thors Hammer. So what I did is I walked from the left to the right, all the way up there to the lower point, and I tried a couple compositions that frame Thors Hammer and some of the hoodoos beyond. And arrived at this location because I like to have Thors Hammer on the left, some of the spires very close on the right that peek into the sky. And most importantly, I used my app on my iPhone, the photographer's ephemeris, to calculate exactly where the sun was going to rise. And I took very careful consideration to make sure that was going to be between Thors Hammer in the foreground and these other elements on the right of the foreground as well. With the late afternoon light, I had some really harsh shadows. It was really hard for me to visualize what it might look like. And I was really hoping that I had a beautiful sunrise to complement the sky, because there was a lot of sky in this scene, but there was never going to be any guarantee. So I decided that I was going to rotate the camera a little bit down to crop out some of the sky, and I was going to try to put Thors Hammer and some of these other hoodoos in the sky, meaning that I would want to position myself a little bit lower so the parallax changes and the spires themselves rise up. Doing research on this location and looking at the signs in the park, most of the rock formations, if not all of the rock formations here, have formed from centuries of erosion. And when you look at the side of this trail, you can see this eroded line of loose dirt and rock. So it's a very dangerous and slippery edge to be on. So there's really nowhere else to go besides this path safely. And if you read the signs on the top before you descend down this path, it asks you not to step off the path because you will damage some of the natural erosion that occurs. So add the combination of not being able to leave the path and that not being allowed, plus that it's very dangerous, and you only really have this main walkway to use to frame this composition. Another challenge of this location is I'm using a fixed 18mm equivalent lens on the Fuji GFX 50S. So I had to give careful consideration to my positioning, and I don't have a lot of wiggle room back and forth or side to side. So I decided to move my camera down fairly low so I could push Thors Hammer up in the sky and also use some of these foreground elements. Now this is a very steep drop, but it does look kind of beautiful in the bottom of the frame. I have some snow as a leading line on the right, and I have this beautiful little pine tree as well that adds a little bit more interest to the beginning of the scene. Given all the constraints of this location and the few areas that you can actually move around, the scene itself is pretty straightforward once you find it. You don't have a lot of variation, only a little bit from side to side and as the path slopes up and down. So once I had the position locked and I was happy with everything, I had my fingers crossed for a good sunrise, went back to the hotel, got some sleep, and arrived here around 6 a.m. for a 7:30 sunrise. Obviously, framing everything the day before when it was light out was much easier than arriving here first thing in the morning when it was completely dark. I'm using a mirrorless camera, which gives me an indication of where I'm focusing, plus uses focus peaking. Now, while it was too dark to see the focus peaking lines, I could just move my dial until I was focused right on infinite. Since this is a wide lens and everything is far away from my camera, I know that I can get a sharp exposure when I focus at infinite. If I was using a DSLR camera, I would have had to wait for the sun to come up just a little bit into a blue hour, and then I would have had to focus on one of the edges of the rock against the sky to find my infinite focus point. A lot of lenses on Nikon cameras, for example, have an infinite setting, but you can actually twist it past infinite, and oftentimes infinity is actually not dead center of the infinity icon. It's a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right. With mirrorless cameras, it can be much more accurate to get that perfect focus because it shows you digitally exactly where your focus plane will be. The previous day, I had calculated the sun would come up right between Thor's hammer and these other spires. Based on the weather forecast showing a clear sky, my original intention was to wait for the sun to rise, touch the horizon, switch to a higher f-stop to be able to capture the lens flare, that starburst of the sun. But as soon as that sun started to come up and we entered into the blue hour, I noticed we had beautiful wispy clouds, and as the sun started to rise and time progressed, the sunrise was absolutely beautiful. It was probably one of the most beautiful sunrises I've seen in a long time, and it perfectly complemented the composition and the scene below. So my original intention was to use the lens burst itself, but now, based on the colors I was able to get in the sky, I think that's the sky I'm going to use. But just like every other landscape shot, when the sun is still below the horizon, you may get the best colors in the sky, but there's still a lack of light in the foreground. So what I decided to do was stay a little bit longer, shoot through, and as the sun came up, I still shot f/22 to capture that beautiful starburst in the sky. And then a little bit later, I actually blocked the sun, went back down to f/8 to capture the foreground with light. My original intention was to capture the starburst, and while I was able to capture the starburst, I'm really happy with the sky, and I think this is going to be a really fun image to blend together with the beautiful sky and the soft light on the foreground. So the next time I see you guys, we're going to be taking a look at everything in Photoshop and figuring out which sky to blend with which foreground. Hello everybody, welcome back to the post-processing studio. Today we are going to be working on the files I captured in Bryce Canyon around the rock formation called Thors Hammer. Let's begin. First of all here, if we take a look in Lightroom, you can see that, well, this is severely backlit. Now, it's a beautiful sunset, but definitely backlit. So let's take a look at the exposures. And here on the bottom in Lightroom, I just want to show you guys that I have 6 images. 3 are marked green in your file. I'm leaving these as a reference so you can see what it looks like to shoot the brackets when it's backlit. So let's just take a look at the brackets here. So underexposed, you can see that the sky is actually fully accounted for there. And as I roll up, the sky's looking pretty good here, starting to get blown out all the way to the exposure here, all the way on the right side. I'm starting to get the foreground to look really nice here, but you can see that sky is gone. So a tremendous amount of variation of dynamic range between these. So the first thing we're going to have to do is actually blend 2 of these exposures together after balancing them here in Lightroom. After that, what we're actually going to do, you can see down here it still feels a little dark in the foreground. We're also going to bring in some time. So we're going to blend in the element of time. After the sun just came over the horizon, I blocked the sun so we don't have any negative effects on the lens itself, so nothing deteriorating or destroying this scene at all. And here you can see the tree is illuminated. You can see here it's not, so we get that nice golden light on the tree and some soft shadows. So we're going to do that last. We're going to bring that in, but first we're going to have to adjust these files. Before we do that though, I want to go ahead and say that we're going to be using the Adobe Standard profile. And if I toggle between here, Adobe Color, and Adobe Standard, you can see you're not going to see a lot of difference now. But if I do it here, I just want to show you guys that if you go to Adobe Standard, it's even more flat. You see those colors just popped. Color and Standard. So Standard kind of flattens everything out. Well, generally, I like to use Adobe Color or Provia, and we'll be using different color modes throughout this tutorial. But when I have to really push values, I use the flattest profile possible, and that one currently is Adobe Standard. Before we get started with the edits, let's create our base layer. So this is going to be our base layer inside of Photoshop, our original RAW, and I'm going to export that. Now I could say export with previous, but in this case I just want to do this one more time. Export, I use the temp folder, so you guys have the settings one more time. PSD, ProPhoto RGB, 16-bit, and that's just going to open up in Photoshop. So here we have the start of our composition here, so let's call this Original raw. Perfect. Let's go back to Lightroom. Let's start with the top exposure, the one for the shadows. Let's just scroll down here. And again, I want to be using Adobe Standard. I'm going to scroll down and just make sure, yep, and there it is. Let's turn the sharpening down and the noise reduction. We'll make sure that's done and removed so that we can right-click this, Develop Settings, Copy Settings. I'm just going to select the Treatment and Profile, Sharpening, Noise Reduction, and that's it. So we'll say Copy, and I'll just select all of them just like this, even the one that I copied from, and paste. So at least that's all unified. We don't have to worry about it. Now it's time to edit this image. First, let's adjust the exposure. I'm going to bring it up a quarter stop, so 0.25. I'm going to follow up with the shadows another 25. Next is that white balance looks a little weird. Let's adjust it. Let's warm it up. 5800. And let's try something else. Let's go the other way. Let's neutralize that color. So around -10 on the tint to just balance it. Give it, a little bit of that warmth and still some of those orange tones, but not over the top. We can always adjust it more a little bit later when we get into Photoshop. Now the next thing is I want to try to do something about the sky. Not that I have any illusions that I can actually bring the sky back. We're going to use this additional exposure down here. But I'm going to try to adjust it at least a little bit. So let's just go ahead and pull the sky down past the mountains just like this, and let's see what we can do. And let's be dramatic. Let's go -2. -50 in the highlights. Let's try that. Yep, it's kind of bringing it back. And let's just compensate by pulling those shadows up. All right, so you can see that by pulling the sky down, one, there's no way I'm going to get back this detail, and two, I am burning the tips of those mountains. So even if I pull the shadows back up to compensate, that's still not helping. It still looks bad. I want to make sure that I leave all that color and detail up here without burning it out. So I could try to adjust the blacks, but you can see that that's not really working either. I'm washing it out. So what I'm going to do here is use one of the range masks down here on the bottom, and I'm going to set this to luminance. This range slider allows me to select the area that is adjusted. In other words, as I start to limit this, it's going to cut out the dark areas. And now I'm just applying this to the light areas. In a similar fashion, if I cut the highlights out or clip the highlights on this side, you can see that it's going to remove the adjustment and just put the adjustment in the shadows. So what I actually want to do is just slide this over so that I can get rid of some of that effect on the mountains just to where it starts to affect the sky. So you can see now it's removing all that effect. And I think I'm going to go halfway, so 50 over 100. So I've cut out 50% gray to black, the dark ranges of this. Now this entire thing, even if I rolled it down here, is not going to be affecting that color range. That's exactly the effect that I'm going for. We'll leave this one here for now. Let's address the middle exposure. So this is going to be the exposure for the sky. Let's go ahead and unify the temperature. That was 5800 and I believe -10. Now let's go a little extreme here. Let's say 1.25 and let's pull the highlights down, the shadows up, and the whites down. So I know that's a little bit extreme, but I'm just concerned about this top portion of the image. First thing we need to do, though, is also adjust the sky, similar to the way we did on the other one, but kind of in the other direction. Let's start by changing the sky, making it look a little bit more like a sunrise, so adding and accentuating these purples and these pinks on the top. Let's also see how the dehaze slider looks. Yeah, that's actually looking pretty nice. Let's add about 15 on the dehaze, and let's compensate by pulling the shadows up. You can see as I ramp those shadows up, it mitigates some of the darkening that dehaze does around the edges. So the other thing here, we probably also want to use the range mask, luminance again. Before we used 50, but I just want to get rid of a little bit on those mountains, so somewhere between 30 and 40, just so I can get rid of the darkening on these parts of the mountain, which overall is not that bad. This gradient's pretty cool because it added 25% tint into the magenta, but what if we want to cool down the top of the sky? Well, let's create an additional gradient ramp that does just that. So we'll move that up so it's top sky, just touching the tops of the mountains. And we'll reset. And let's go ahead and cool it down -25. Let's also pull those shadows up to try to remove some of that light vignetting there on the corners. Now let's do something for the center of the image. So for the sky itself, let's draw a nice wide elliptical mask, just like that. Now obviously these settings are a little out of control. I don't want to overexpose it. But what I do want is to warm it up and tint it a little bit. And that's just going to warm up the heat from the sun. The other thing I can do is help some of these shadows here by just pulling those up just a little bit. So I can pull some shadows up in that mountainscape and clean it up. And I'll just go ahead and move that until I get it just right. So this is going to cause some of the heat from the sun, that warmth. Since we cooled and tinted this part of the sky, and we actually tinted part of this with it, this will just reverse that and bring it back into the warm, sunny sort of look, which is perfect because that sun's just about to hit the edge of the horizon. Let's close that out and take a look. So we have this one and this one. Actually, pretty close. Now you can see here, and this is interesting too in the foreground, with this exposure that's pretty close to correctly exposed already for the foreground, not the sky, for example. If we go to the one where we had to adjust it, you can see the difference here. That snow is really dark and would need further adjustment. But in the exposure out of camera that's correct, the snow is almost perfect. It's almost perfectly exposed already. Either way, though, let's get both of these into Photoshop. I'm going to select them both, right-click, export with previous, use unique names. And now let's select all, Command A, copy Command C, close Command W. I'm going to go into the original one and paste with a Command V. And I'm just going to do that for this one here really quick. And paste. So we're going to call this original raw. We're going to call this background, BKGR, and we're going to call this sky. And here we have this one and this one. So at this point, you guys might be asking, well, why didn't you just edit this single raw file? Why did you decide to bring two in? Well, a couple reasons. First, if we take a look at the snow, I already explained that in Lightroom, but you can see the color difference is quite substantial, and I don't really want to go in there and color correct that snow and make it look realistic, because it's really difficult to bring the luminance of something like that out. The second thing actually is the noise, and if I zoom in on this, it's really going to start to make sense. Way in on the background, since this was a few stops beneath the optimum exposure for the foreground, you can see that if I use the background image, it's a little bit more clean. But if I put the sky image in, we're going to start to see some of that color noise. So this is two stops basically. The more you go, the more noise you're going to get. And while it's definitely in the acceptable range, 2 stops with the GFX 50S by Fujifilm is definitely acceptable. I just want to show you guys how we can blend these two things together. If you're worried about that noise differential and you don't like the changes that happen in the foreground because of overcorrection inside a Lightroom, with something like this, since they're so close and the noise differential is so close too, in other words, the noise isn't going to change or be noticeable if we blend it together, we can simply blend this using a gradient. So I'm going to create a new mask, use the gradient tool, and from white to black, just like this, I'm going to fade that sky in and those mountains. Now let's jump back into Lightroom. Now that we've adjusted the base image, let's talk about the light layer. So this is actually really close, but really I want you guys to see a long Thors hammer down here in the canyon, these little spires, all of that. We have little fingers of light. Before and after, we actually start to see that pooling light and some of those pooling shadows. Personally, I always like to have a lot of dynamic lighting in my scene, so I like to blend time. And in this case, when the sun was at the peak of the beautiful colors for the sunrise, it wasn't actually emitting anything more than ambient light. Once that sun breached the horizon, just came up above the horizon, it gave off soft light and soft shadows, so I left the camera in the same place, shot everything, and now I can bring this in, and it should blend seamlessly in. But first we have to adjust it a little bit. So if we go here to here, I feel like this is just a little darker. So let's just go ahead and bring the shadows up, just like this, 25. And let's just look before and after. Even the white balance is pretty close. And they're not the same. Here you can see 5800 and -10, and here you can see 4550 plus 14. It's because it's a different time of day. Visually, they look really close. So let's go ahead and export this as well. Select all, copy, close, and paste. I'm going to name this light layer. Now, if we take a look at it, off and on, everything looks good except for, once again, the hand in the frame. So this is going to be pretty easy. We're going to start with a gradient on a mask, and it's going to be something like white to, you guessed it, top of the finger there is going to be the last thing, and that's going to be gone. And if I just toggle this, it actually looks pretty good. But let's take a look at what's actually happening. I love everything that's happening in the foreground. I really like what's happening on Thor's hammer. I like these little chiseled out details. I'm not really happy with the way that it's darkening the mountain behind the tree. So let's just use the brush tool. Maybe a low flow, 10 or 20, and we'll just go ahead and paint. We'll leave the tree in there and just paint some of this out. Pretty easy. Same thing here with Thor's hammer, just the opposite. We're going to go ahead and paint in some of that light on the side of Thor's hammer. Pretty easy. So now we have this and this. So we have some dynamic lighting now added to the scene. So now that our blend is complete, I'm going to use Shift, Option, Command, E, and I'm going to unify it with Adobe Camera Raw Filter, ACRF, up here, Filter, Camera Raw Filter. I'll tell you what, let's do this all selectively. First thing is the foreground. So I want to select the foreground all the way up to the mountains themselves, just leaving the sky in just a hair. I'm going to go ahead and reset this. And I want to bring the exposure up. Let's bring it up half a stop. And let's adjust this a little bit more so it goes up a little bit higher here. Perfect. And I'm also going to pull the highlights back a little bit. That way I don't ruin the exposure here on the snow. It is a white object, so I want to make sure I don't blow out those values. So that should protect it just a little bit. And let's add a little bit of dehaze. If we go too far, you can see it's going to add too much contrast, but just a light amount sometimes is really nice. While we're on the topic of the foreground, let's also do a color shift. So let's try to differentiate this deep foreground with the middle ground. So I'm going to reset this one more time, and let's bring the temperature up. So somewhere around 20, we'll warm it up, and then we'll change the tint to the green spectrum to make it a little bit more yellow and a little bit more orange. So plus 20, minus 20, and we'll just adjust that here. So we want it to be maybe actually start at the base of the tree to just above the tree. Last one for the sky. Cut into the mountains just a little bit. Let's change that just about there. Reset it once again. Let's pull the highlights down a little bit. -50. Let's compensate by raising the shadows to 50. Let's add a little bit of dehaze. A little bit of good old-fashioned contrast. And let's go ahead and bring that temperature down just a little bit too, just to cool off the top. That's a little bit too much. Let's just do 10 maybe. Yeah, that looks a little bit better. That's actually what I'm trying to achieve. Just cooling off the top part of the blue and still being able to see those nice, beautiful pink and red hues. Let's apply that. And before and after, I like the way that this is coming together, but I want to address a few things really quickly. I feel like this red is a little too saturated. Sometimes when you're shooting sunrises and sunsets, the colors are actually so intense and so vivid that you have to roll them back a little bit in post, or else they can seem a little unbelievable, or the saturation levels can feel a little bit broken. In this case, I think everything looks great, but that red just seems a little too red for me. So let's go ahead and create a hue and saturation layer, and I'm going to go specifically to the reds, and we're going to lighten that up a little bit. And you can see that we're lightening up just those reds. Now, obviously, I don't want to destroy the other parts of the beautiful sky, just that. So let's call this red reduction. And I'll black out this mask using Command Delete. And with a brush, a very small brush and a light brush, I'll just go in and paint in selectively that specific area of the sky, those specific tones that I want to adjust, and we'll just double check it there to there, a little bit more, or let's say in this case, a little bit less saturated. I want to do the same thing with the snow, but with the blues. Bring up the hue saturation layer, go to the blues, and I'm going to select more here. So I'm actually going to change this again just to recap how this works. Inside of these areas is what's hard selected. This is a soft selection. So from here to here is a fade of what's actually going to be manipulated. Now most of that is just going to be in the blue channel and the cyan channel, and you can see now if I change this, the light in the same way, only the blues and the cyans are affected. In this case, the sky and the snow. So what I'm going to do is figure out how white I want that snow to be. Looks like right about there, around 40. And I'm going to do the same thing here. We'll go ahead and close that and zero out that mask with Command Delete. Zoom in just a hair with the brush tool, larger brush, and 40 on the flow. I'm actually just going to paint that manually in, so that's all going to become white. We'll name this Blue Reduction. Now there are a few strange things happening here, and I really hate to say it, but they look like halos. Look at Thor's hammer. It looks like it has a light behind it. See how it's creating this halo effect in front of the mountain? So it's got that white edge here and that white edge here. Even on the side of these spires, it just looks bad. And when you start to notice it, even when you zoom out, you still notice it, like it's a mistake, like we did some sort of masking here that caused that. Even though nowhere else around these edges, anywhere else in our image does this happen. In other words, it's probably also in the original RAW. And if we actually zoom in on the original RAW, you can see that it is, once we get to the background plate, a little bit lighter behind that, once we start to pull that detail out. So nothing that we really did here changed it. It just kind of brought more attention to something that was already there. So what I like to say, when reality is wrong, fix reality. So that's what we're going to do. And it's fairly simple. I'm just going to turn these color corrections back on. They don't really matter because they're below. I'm going to go ahead and create a folder, and we're going to call this Edge Cleanup. And what I'm going to do is create a mask on this. But what I'm going to do first is create the selection that I want to use as a mask. So the first thing I need to do is use the lasso tool. That's L on the keyboard. I'm going to zoom in a little bit more. And I'm going to select this area. So basically I'm going to select the edge of this rock, and I'm just going to freehand it, make sure it's about a pixel to 2 pixels inside the edge, just like this. And remember, when I hold Option key with the lasso, it turns into the polygonal lasso, makes it a little bit easier. But I'm using the stylus, so I can probably just kind of freehand this around just a little bit. And we'll go ahead and bring this down more, a little bit more, all the way around. All the way around. Let's go ahead and select this too. Might as well do it right the first time. All the way around. Now I can just terminate this up here, just like that. So that looks pretty good. Scroll over here, scroll over to Thor's hammer, and we'll do the same. So I'm going to hold Shift, and I'm going to cut in a new mask. Just like that. All the way around here. And I'm just freehanding this one. Pretty easy to do with the stylus. One of the benefits of having a Wacom tablet and a stylus is you can get away with doing this. And let's just go ahead and terminate this out here. Same thing, other side. Hold Shift, cut in the mask right about here. And I'll just start to go around this. Now this doesn't have to be perfect, and you'll see why in a moment. And we'll terminate that right around here. Now, when I create a new mask, it'll put a mask on that folder. I can create a new layer. We'll call this Cleanup Layer. Spell it right. Perfect. All right, so now the fun part. What I'm actually going to do is use the clone stamp with a flow of about 10. And what I'm actually going to do is start selecting parts of the landscape, or this mountainscape in the background, that doesn't have any of this haloing effect. So that's the darkness that I want. And I'm just going to move that over, and I'm just going to start painting that in to this landscape, just like that. So we're just going to repeat that pattern No problem. And it doesn't matter if those edges, and you'll see why in just a moment. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And you can see that I'm creating some rough edges around this, my selection, which is not a problem. Same thing here. Let's go out here. Back here. Let's go ahead and do that. Pick a flow of 20% just to speed this up a little bit. Same thing. I'm just trying to darken that so it's the same. You can see we have a little bit left right here. So what we're going to need to do here is select something like this and find an edge that will match, which will be something like this. And then just go into it just on that edge. So that looks pretty good, just like that. Now you can see that when I turn this on and off, we've actually come inside of this edge, which is fine. All we need to do is go up here, go to the properties, and feather this by 1 pixel. And you can see now it looks like a new edge. So it doesn't have to be perfect. That's why I said follow the inside, and that'll just be the new edge of the rock, which follows the contour, comes in 1 pixel. So same thing. When we scroll over here, we're just going to have to do this a little bit more carefully. I'm going to grab the top of, let's say, this, so that we can put that here. And we'll just start to pull some of that in, just like that. We'll pick the top of this tree here, maybe. Let's go back a little bit more. Like that. Sort of pull some of this in. We'll just be really careful. It's quite annoying to do this because that halo shouldn't be there. It shouldn't exist, but for some reason it does. So we just have to make sure that it's not noticeable. And usually the rule is if nobody knew it was there or wasn't there, they won't notice when you remove it. But if you look at this, you can definitely tell there's a halo, but it's easier to tell when there's nothing there at all. So, same thing, last one here. Grab a point around here. That looks like some nice detail. And I'll just start to paint that in. Paint that just like that. Just to get rid of some of that. Not a problem. Same thing here. We'll grab an edge. Like that. Pull that in. And not too happy with this. Anytime you're not happy with it, just delete it and try it again. Because I felt like I did a little bit too much to that. I don't feel like this side needs too much. We're going to go down to 10% and we'll get this right this time. I think that looks a little bit better. Let's zoom it out. And we can see before and after. We have a little bit more work to do on this side. Let's grab a little bit more of this and sort of pull that in, just so it's not as noticeable. Perfect. Before and after. Nice. All right, zoom that out and we'll take a look. A correction now just got rid of those highlights. So nobody's going to be drawn towards those things as a potential mistake. That looks pretty good. So at this point, everything's starting to look really nice. This is where I'd start to think about doing some dodging and burning. But in this lesson, I want to introduce a new, more precise method for dodging and burning. And it's actually called luminosity dodging and luminosity burning. Essentially what we're going to do is create a couple luminosity masks that are going to help us isolate just the highlights and just the shadows for the image so we can edit them in a more precise way. Now let's start by going to the channels palette. Now I know this might be a little bit of a review for you guys, but it's still always nice to cover. Now since this is in the channels and since each one of these is actually already black and white, it can be loaded as a selection just by holding Command and clicking on it. So I could load red as a selection, green as a selection, blue as a selection. Once any of these are loaded, I can go here and I can create any new layer, anything, and apply that same selection as a mask. So it's very powerful. So let's go back to the channels palette for just a second. And I'll turn that off so it's not magenta. Let's go ahead and load RGB. Now RGB is going to be a combination of everything, and I'm going to create a new channel by clicking this icon right here, and it's going to be alpha 1. Now this is really interesting. I'm going to deselect with Command D, this is actually, if you think about it and if you look at it, a selection for the highlights. So in masking, anything that's white is selected, anything that's black is not selected. If I invert this with the Command I, then it becomes a selection for the shadows. You can see that the shadows are then selected, and since there are way more shadows here, there is way more that's actually white. So inverting, selecting the highlights, inverting, selecting the shadows. Well, let's create two. Let's go ahead and create first a highlights. And I'm just going to go ahead and duplicate this by dragging it down here to the Make New Layer button. And Command I invert, and we'll call this shadows. So let's put this highlights mask into action by loading it, Command click, going back to layers, and what I'm actually going to do, on top of everything, I'm going to create a new folder, click on the Create New Mask, and we're going to call this Clamped Highlights. And here's why. Right now, if I take a look at this, if I were to, let's say, put a curves layer inside of this folder, and I were to change everything, you can see that it's pretty much affecting most of the highlights. Well, what if I just want to affect some or more precise portions of the highlights, like just these areas here along the ground, just the edges of the trees, just these parts in the rocks? Well, what I can actually do is clamp that. And if I option click the mask, you can actually see what I'm going to do. I'm going to load curves with Command M. And that's going to load the curves up. I'm just going to put it up here. This is not an adjustment layer, so this is destructive. And what I can actually do is start pulling this to the left, and I can actually drop off more shadows. So now we're seeing more concentration of the highlights and more clamp levels here. And if I do this by pulling this to the left, I'm actually clamping those values. So I'm increasing the contrast range here and isolating those highlights from the shadows. So it becomes very powerful, something just like that. So that is a clamped version, clamped highlights. So let's start with this curves layer, and let's make something that's a little bit more global. Now what I want to actually do with this curves layer is I want to affect everything from here to about the sky. I actually don't want the sky to be affected by this, because if I load these curves, what I want to do is really ramp up these highlights. So you see those highlights in the foreground now are changing, and it's all being manipulated inside of that mask that's on the folder. So all the shadows are staying intact. So very quickly, I can just ramp up those highlights. But it is causing one issue, and that issue is the snow. So what I can actually do then is just bring up the mask, and I can actually paint some of that effect out here on the snow, so I'm not blowing out those highlights. So everything else but the snow ends up getting the benefit of that. So this controls the global highlights on the bottom part of the image. I can also paint some in as well if I want a little bit more on Thor's hammer itself, some of the areas here on these highlights. I can actually paint and adjust that. Now, while this is technically luminosity masking, I want to show you guys what luminosity dodging is. Well, we can do the same thing by loading a curves. And let's say that I just crank this up quite ridiculously to about here, but instead I black this out with Command Delete on the keyboard. So it is a black mask on a curves layer, and we're going to call this Dodge. And with the brush and a very low flow, let's just start with about 10, I can start to hand paint in some of these highlights. Let's go even lower. When I'm dodging, I like to go really low on the values, but I can start to pull some of this in and really accentuate these bits of light here in the foreground. Make it feel like that light really is streaming in here. Same thing on these areas of the valley, all this back here, parts of Thor's hammer. And what's really cool, the reason I said that this is more precise from dodging and burning, you can see that as I start to roll over the shadows, nothing's happening. It's not actually changing it, and that's because it's controlled by this layer. So none of that's actually going to be affected. And even if I were to dodge over this area, it's not going to do too much to it. In fact, it might look pretty nice because it's just going to pick up more of those specular highlights. So this is really nice for clamping and controlling your specular highlights even before you start dodging and burning. So it can be really powerful. So just here to here, we've actually given the image quite a bit more drama. Now I notice in the foreground it may have gone a little overboard. So again, this is easy because what you mask in you can also quickly mask out. So that was luminosity dodging. Can you guys guess how to do luminosity burning? Exactly the same way. So we have the highlights here. Let's grab the shadows. Here in the shadows, I'm just going to load it, Command click, go back here to the layers. Go ahead and collapse that and create a new folder. We'll call this clamped shadows. And I'm option clicking here, Command M for curves, and let's go ahead and do the same thing. Let's get rid of all of those highlights. I don't want any highlights in there. I just want the shadows selected. So just the shadows, shadow areas, really heavy duty clamp on that, and I'll say OK. Same thing here, I'll just click that so we can see the image, create a curves layer, and we'll name this burn. And of course we have to edit it. You can see that as I do that, it's going to pull that contrast down. So I'll be pretty liberal about it here, and we'll black this out. And start brushing it in selectively. So maybe some more back here, some of these areas. And again, the nice thing is when I start to do this, I can actually start to pull some contrast down in these lower areas to start to separate the layers of the foreground and the background. The nice thing is as I'm darkening up these areas, it's not going to affect any of the highlights and any of the dodging that I've done already. So this can be really tremendously powerful and much more precise. Then again, dodging and burning is a little bit more free form because you can just paint white, paint black over a gray layer and sort of mix as you go. This is more precise because we're stuck within a channel selection before we even start manipulating light and shadows. So it's up to you guys which one you want to use. Certain situations I actually prefer this, the precision, especially when there already are a lot of chiseled out highlights and shadows we can follow. So you can see before and after, not too dramatic. We may actually need to go into the curves itself and pull that down even more just to make it more dramatic. And then also brush in a little bit more just to sort of bring that in the valley there and darken it up. That looks pretty good. Now at this point, looking at the histogram, it's easy to tell that we're missing some values here. Well, not missing, it's just that the overall image is a little bit dark, and that's because we've tried to protect the highlights. Since we've already created the luminosity masks, let's go ahead and utilize those to try to bump the midtones of the image. Now first, this is basically what I want to do. I want to be able to create a curves layer, I want to be able to look at the histogram, and I want to be able to just bump this up and change the gamma of the image overall. But I can't do that because I'm going to be blowing out the sky, because I'm going to lose those values. The further I push it, the further I'm going to lose them. I could put a mask and do more to the foreground, but I want everything to be affected except for the highlights. So let's actually delete this curves layer. Let's go back to the channels and see what we can do. I'm going to go ahead and close this to give us more room. Well, I have the highlights here and I have the shadows. What if I just take the shadows, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to Command click shadows, go back to layers, create a folder, and we're just going to call this shadows. I'm going to Command click, go back to layers, and create a new curves. Now what's cool here is the histogram is going to look a little bit different, and if I start to really clamp this down, even if I go ridiculously, it's actually protecting those highlights. You can still see those highlights sitting there. Now obviously I'm going to do a lot of damage, it's not clamped, but what I can do is actually start to ramp this up just a little bit and globally change the image, brighten the whole thing up while still protecting those highlights. And you can see that before and after. Adds quite a bit, brings that, and actually shifts the entirety of the histogram a little bit to the right while protecting the highlights. Now this histogram is not great here in Photoshop. You can kind of see that we do have some spillover here on the right. And when I load this, you can see it actually feels like you can really see where the edge of those pixels stop, where that color and luminosity stops. But this is good enough, and we can always tell when something's blown out visibly too on the screen. Let me zoom out a little bit too. Last thing I want to address is the distortion of this image. It's not barrel distortion, but just distortion. Like I feel like the camera's rotated down, so this edge should be a little bit more straight. This one too. And I feel like Thor's hammer should sort of skew out a little bit and seem a little bit more straight. So what I'm going to do now is select everything, every single layer, and I'm going to transform it. I'm going to do this manually with Command T, which is the transform tool, and I'm actually going to hold Command, and you can see that that's going to allow me to skew. I'm going to hold Shift, which is going to lock it, and I'm going to hold Option, which is going to mirror it. Now, it's kind of cool because as I do this, all the way on the left side there, see that highlight? See this guy over here? I think that's kind of interesting. This is a little distracting to me. So if I start to do this, I'm going to get rid of that, and I'm going to start to fix this image. So you can see that now that line over here is pretty much straight, and I can continue a little bit more here and actually stretch it just a little bit down, just like that. So it doesn't have to be perfect. The reason it doesn't have to be perfect is you can tell these are actually going down in perspective. So Thor's hammer can do the same thing, but it's just going to fix it a little bit. It's going to make it look a little bit more, I don't know, straight and kind of even and planned. Let's go ahead and apply that. That looks pretty good. Now let's take a look at everything that we've done. We started with this as an original raw, which is quite extraordinary. From there, we actually adjusted the background image. Then we replaced the sky with a correct adjustment, brought in the light layer on the bottom, adjusted everything together, cleaned up those little edges around the rocks themselves, clamped the highlights and did some dodging and burning, mitigated some of the color both in the blues and the reds, and lastly, we did one big boost to the brightness of the image. So at the beginning of this lesson, we started with this, and at the end, we ended up with this. I feel like that was a really great lesson, and that wraps things up here in the post-processing studio. Next time I see you guys, we will be exploring more of the beautiful American Southwest.